An anniversary dinner turns into a reckoning. A struggling elderly couple walks into an upscale restaurant, hoping to celebrate 50 years of love. But a secret looms beneath their smiles. When their card is declined, humiliation follows, until NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal steps in. But this isn't just about a bill. A long-buried injustice resurfaces, and the night spirals into a clash of pride, power, and long-overdue justice. As hidden truths unravel, one question remains: will this be a night of redemption or reckoning? The past never stays buried. And tonight, the tables are turning. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Luther Dawson adjusted his tie in the small bathroom mirror, running a hand through his thinning gray hair. The tuxedo he wore was old but well kept, the fabric holding memories of better times, times when dressing up for a fancy dinner wasn't a luxury, but a routine. His reflection stared back at him, tired eyes betraying the emotions he tried to suppress. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration, a milestone of 50 years with Celeste, the love of his life. But beneath the polished shoes and the crisp white collar, he carried a secret too heavy to ignore. In the bedroom, Celeste hummed softly as she clasped her pearl necklace around her delicate neck. The pearls were slightly yellowed with age, yet they still gleamed under the dim light. She had worn this necklace on their very first date, when Luther had saved up months of wages just to buy it for her. It wasn't a most expensive gift, but to her it was priceless. "Luther, do you remember when you first gave me these pearls?" she called out, her voice light with nostalgia. Luther forced a smile as he stepped into the room. "Of course, Cel. You wouldn't let me forget even if I tried." She laughed, playfully swatting his arm. "That's because it was the most romantic thing anyone had ever done for me. And now, here we are, 50 years later. 50 years. Half a century of love, struggle and sacrifice. And now, as they prepared for this grand evening, Luther couldn't shake the knot tightening in his stomach. He had checked the numbers more times than he could count. The bank account was nearly empty. The pension barely covered their expenses. This dinner would stretch them to their absolute limit. But Celeste had been looking forward to this for months. There was no way he could take that joy away from her. He reached for his wallet on the nightstand and slipped his old credit card inside his pocket, praying that it wouldn't betray him tonight. The restaurant, La Violette, stood tall and proud in the heart of the city, its golden lights casting a warm glow onto the bustling street. Inside, the air was filled with the clinking of fine china, murmurs of soft conversation, and the rich aroma of decadent meals. A pianist played in the background, his fingers dancing across the keys in a slow, elegant melody. Celeste's eyes widened in admiration as she took in the opulent surroundings. "Oh, Luther, this place is breathtaking. You really went all out for tonight, didn't you?" Luther swallowed, tightening his grip on her hand. "Only the best for you, my love." A waiter in a crisp black uniform approached, leading them to a table near the center of the room. As Luther pulled out Celeste's chair, a deep voice rumbled from a few tables away. "Man, I keep telling y'all, nothing beats a good meal in good company." Luther turned his head slightly. At the far end of the restaurant, seated at a large table, was none other than Shaquille O'Neal. The former basketball legend was larger than life, both in presence and in stature. Dressed in a tailored suit, he sat with a group of friends, laughing as he recounted a story. The entire room seemed to orbit around him, drawn to his easy charm and warmth. Celeste noticed Luther's lingering gaze, and smiled. "Even after all these years, you still love basketball, don't you?" Luther chuckled. "Some things never change." The waiter returned, placing menus in front of them. As Celeste eagerly flipped through the options, Luther skimmed the prices. $65 for steak, $50 for seafood. Even the appetizers were more than they used to spend on an entire meal. He forced his breathing to stay even, masking the panic that threatened to rise. "I think I'll get the filet mignon," Celeste said happily. "What about you, dear?" Luther hesitated. "I'm not too hungry. Maybe just a salad." Celeste frowned. "A salad? Luther, this is our anniversary. Let's enjoy it. I just don't have much of an appetite, that's all." He smiled, hoping to move past the conversation. A few tables away, Shaq watched the couple with quiet interest. He wasn't one to eavesdrop, but something about the way Luther scanned the menu, the way he fidgeted slightly, caught his attention. He had seen that look before, the look of a man trying to maintain dignity in a difficult situation. Meanwhile, At a nearby table, a different kind of attention was brewing. Preston Holloway, a wealthy businessman known for his arrogance, sipped his wine as he observed the Dawsons. A smirk played on his lips as he leaned toward his companion. "People like that don't belong in places like this," he muttered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. Luther stiffened, his ears catching the remark. He gritted his teeth but said nothing. Not tonight. He wouldn't let anything ruin this for Celeste. As the meal went on, Celeste glowed with happiness, reminiscing about their life together. "Do you remember our first home? That tiny apartment with the leaky roof?" Luther laughed, the memory momentarily pushing away his worries. "How could I forget? We had to put buckets everywhere when it rained. And you promised you'd build me a house one day. And you did, Luther. You kept your word." His smile faltered slightly. "The house. The one they had to sell when finances crumbled." But he nodded, not wanting to break the magic of the moment. Their waiter returned, placing the bill discreetly on the table. Luther's stomach twisted as he reached for it, unfolding the small piece of paper. His hand tightened around the edge of the table. He slipped his credit card onto the tray and handed it back, keeping his expression neutral. The waiter returned moments later, his voice hushed. "Sir, I'm afraid your card has been declined." The world around him seemed to slow. Celeste glanced up, confusion flickering in her eyes. "That's not possible," Luther said, keeping his voice steady. "Try it again." The waiter nodded, stepping away. Luther exhaled sharply, his hands beginning to tremble under the table. Celeste reached for his hand. "Luther, what's wrong?" Before he could answer, Preston chuckled from his table. "Some people should really know their limits before walking into places like this." The words sent a chill down Luther's spine. He looked up, his gaze locking with Preston's cold, mocking eyes. For a moment silence stretched between them, the weight of unspoken history pressing down. Shaq, still watching from his table, set his glass down. He had seen enough. The waiter returned, clearing his throat. "Sir, I'm sorry, but your card is still declined." Luther felt the walls closing in. He had no backup plan. No extra cash. Nothing. Celeste's voice, soft yet filled with quiet worry, broke through the moment. "Luther, tell me the truth. What's going on?" Luther swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sell. I don't have the money." The truth hung between them, raw and exposed. Across the room, Shaq rose from his seat. And just like that, the night had taken a turn no one saw coming. Luther cleared his throat, forcing a polite smile at the waiter. "Try the card one more time, please." His voice was steady, but inside a storm raged. The waiter nodded, taking the card back. Celeste's brows furrowed, her fingers gently brushing against Luther's. "Luther, what does he mean declined?" He exhaled, measuring his words. "It's probably just a mistake." But deep down he knew the truth. The account was dry. Every dime had gone to bills, prescriptions, and keeping the lights on at home. He had convinced himself there would be just enough for tonight, but clearly, he had been wrong. Across the room, Preston Holloway took a slow sip of his wine, watching the unfolding scene with thinly veiled amusement. Dressed in an expensive three-piece suit, he looked every bit the powerful, untouchable businessman he claimed to be. The kind of man who never had to worry about a declined card or an empty bank account. He leaned slightly toward his table companion, chuckling under his breath. "See, that's the problem. People like them try to live a life they can't afford. And then they wonder why they get embarrassed." Luther heard it. The words stung, but he didn't react. Not yet. Dignity was the only thing he had left to hold on to. At the far end of the restaurant, Shaquille O'Neal leaned back in his chair, observing. The tension at Luther's table was impossible to ignore. He could feel it in the way Luther's shoulders stiffened, in the way Celeste's eyes searched for answers, in the way Preston's smug grin lingered a little too long. Shaq had been in enough rooms, met enough people, and seen enough moments like this to recognize what was happening. This wasn't just about a bill. This was about pride, about struggle, about a man trying to keep his head above water in a world that didn't care if he drowned. The waiter returned, voice low. "Sir, I'm sorry, but the card still isn't working." Celeste inhaled sharply. Luther forced another smile, but it was thinner this time, stretched over the growing cracks in his composure. "It's fine," he said, reaching into his pocket for another card. He hesitated before handing it over. "This was the last one. If this didn't work..." Preston smirked. "What's the matter?" Didn't check your balance before playing rich for the night? Luther's jaw clenched, his fingers gripping the table edge. The world around him seemed smaller, the soft murmurs of other diners fading into background noise. Shaq shifted in his seat. He wasn't about to let this play out without stepping in. But first he needed to understand what kind of man Luther Dawson was. Some men accepted help with gratitude, others with resistance. And then there were those who would rather drown than take an outstretched hand. Shaq had a feeling Luther was the last kind. The waiter swiped the second card. The machine beeped. Another decline. Celeste gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. The color drained from Luther's face. Preston laughed, shaking his head. Oh, this is sad. Shaq exhaled through his nose. That was it. Enough was enough. He stood up. The movement was slight, but in a room like this, Shaquille O'Neal standing up was impossible to ignore. The sheer presence of him, towering over every other guest, demanded attention. Conversations quieted. Eyes turned. Shaq stepped forward, approaching Luther and Celeste's table, with an ease that only a man of his confidence could carry.
Luther Dawson, right?
His deep voice was warm, calm, but firm. Luther blinked in confusion. Why, yes? Shaq smiled. Man, I thought I recognized you. You used to be the best damn lawyer in town. What happened to that sharp suit you always wore back in the day? A flicker of something crossed Luther's face, recognition, mixed with surprise and something dangerously close to shame. Celeste's head snapped toward her husband. Luther, you know Shaquille O'Neal. Luther hesitated. We've crossed paths before. Shaq gave a knowing nod, then turned to the waiter. Put their bill on me. Luther's spine went rigid. No. Shaq raised an eyebrow. No? Luther shook his head. I appreciate the offer, Mr. O'Neal, but I can't accept that. Shaq studied him. This wasn't just about money. This was about a man holding on to the last thread of his dignity, refusing to be seen as weak. Preston chuckled, swirling his wine. Of course he won't accept it. Too much pride. And look where that's gotten him. Luther turned sharply, his voice a low growl. You don't know a damn thing about me. Preston shrugged. I know enough. I know that men like you spend their whole lives thinking hard work is enough. And then reality hits. And suddenly, you're sitting in a restaurant you can't afford, hoping someone pities you. Celeste flinched at the words. But Luther didn't break. Not yet. Shaq placed a hand on Luther's shoulder. Not forcefully, just enough to ground him. Forget him. Shaq said calmly. Let me do this for you. Luther shook his head. It's not about you. It's about me. About what I promised my wife tonight. Shaq's respect for the man grew in that moment. He saw something familiar in him. The kind of strength that didn't come from money or fame, but from fighting battles that no one else ever saw. The waiter hesitated. Sir, how would you like to proceed? Luther inhaled deeply. He had only one option left. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a worn leather wallet. Inside was a single, neatly folded $20 bill. He placed it on the table. That's all I have, he said quietly. Celeste's eyes filled with tears. Preston scoffed. Pathetic. Shaq's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. You don't know the first thing about what's pathetic. It wasn't Shaq. It wasn't Luther. It was the waiter. All eyes turned to him. The young man's hands were clenched at his sides, his face tight with anger as he glared at Preston. You sit here in your expensive suit, talking down to people you don't even know, the waiter continued, his voice shaking. You think money makes you better than everyone else? You think a little hardship is something to laugh at? Preston raised an eyebrow, clearly unbothered. And who exactly do you think you are? The waiter exhaled slowly, forcing himself to calm down. He turned back to Luther and Celeste, his voice softer. Sir, ma'am, I don't usually do this, but just take the meal. No charge. Luther stiffened. Son, I can't. Please, the waiter insisted. Call it a gift, not from pity, but because some people in this world still believe in kindness. The room was silent. Shaq folded his arms, nodding approvingly. Smart man. Luther swallowed hard, looking at Celeste. She gave him a small nod, tears shimmering in her eyes. Finally, slowly, Luther reached out, covering the waiter's hand with his own. Thank you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And just like that, the night had shifted. Shaq glanced at Preston one last time, smirking. Guess you were wrong about people, huh? For the first time, Preston had no response, and as Shaq sat back down, the night took another unexpected turn, one that no one, not even him, saw coming. Luther stared at the leather billfold lying on the table, his fingers hovering just above it. His pulse quickened as he flipped it open, eyes locking onto the numbers at the bottom of the receipt. His hands felt cold. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his credit card, the same one that had betrayed him earlier. Maybe it would work this time. Maybe the machine had just glitched before. Celeste smiled at him from across the table, still glowing from the warmth of the evening. She had no idea of the weight pressing down on him. He forced a smile. "Give me just a second, sweetheart." Sliding the card into the billfold, he signaled the waiter, who nodded and took it. The man walked briskly toward the register at the front of the restaurant. Luther exhaled slowly, his hand curling into a loose fist on the table. "Please, just let it go through." Celeste sighed happily. "This has been a beautiful night, Luther. I feel like we're young again." Luther nodded, but he couldn't focus. His ears were trained on the front of the restaurant, where the waiter swiped his card. The small machine beeped twice, a pause, then another beep. The waiter's face tightened. Luther's stomach dropped. The waiter returned, lowering his voice. "Sir, I'm afraid your card has been declined." A sharp silence cut through the table. Celeste blinked. "What?" Luther swallowed hard. That can't be right. Try it again." The waiter nodded and walked back. Preston Holloway, sitting at a nearby table, lifted his wine glass, watching the exchange with thinly veiled amusement. His lips curled into a smirk as he leaned toward his dinner companion. "Should have stuck to the early bird special," he muttered just loud enough to be heard. Shaquille O'Neal, still seated at his table, across the restaurant, stiffened. He had been keeping an eye on the couple all night, sensing something was off. Now he knew exactly what it was. The waiter swiped the card again. Another sharp beep. Decline. The machine might as well have been screaming it across the room. The waiter hesitated before walking back. This time the conversation didn't stay private. "Sir, I'm sorry, but your card isn't working." The table felt like it was spinning. Luther could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. He fumbled for his wallet, fingers shaking slightly as he pulled out his backup card, the last one he had. "Try this one," he said, voice tight. The waiter nodded, but his expression was tired, knowing. Celeste's smile was gone now. The joy from the evening evaporated into uncertainty. She tilted her head slightly, searching his face. "Luther, what's going on?" He forced a chuckle, trying to downplay the situation. "It's nothing, Cel. Just a mix-up with the bank." Preston let out a low laugh, shaking his head as he sliced his steak. "Mix-up, or just a man living beyond his means?" Luther ignored him. He had to. The waiter swiped the second card. Decline. Luther's breath hitched. The waiter's face said it all before he even spoke. "I'm sorry, sir. This one's not working either." Celeste's fingers tightened around the stem of her wine glass. "Luther." He clenched his jaw, exhaling through his nose. His hands curled into fists. I don't understand. I checked everything before we came." Preston smirked. "What's the matter, old man? Didn't check close enough?" The words hit like a slap, but Luther kept his gaze on the table. He wouldn't let this man see him break. The restaurant manager approached now, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. He was tall, lean, and carried himself like a man who didn't tolerate nonsense. His name tag read Elliot Marks. "Sir," the manager said smoothly, folding his hands in front of him, "we're going to need you to settle the bill." Luther felt small. The restaurant wasn't just watching him, it was swallowing him whole. Celeste's eyes darted between him and the manager, realization dawning slowly. "Luther, tell me the truth. Do we have the money for this dinner?" His throat tightened. "Of course we do." He lied. Celeste didn't believe him. The restaurant buzzed with low murmurs, people sneaking glances at their table. Preston took another sip of his wine, clearly entertained. "Maybe they should wash dishes," he joked. His dinner companion laughed. Luther snapped his gaze toward him, fury flashing in his tired eyes. Shaq finally stood up. The sheer movement of a 7'1" man rising from his chair commanded attention. The atmosphere shifted as he walked toward the couple's table, his presence sending a ripple through the room. "Luther," Shaq said, his voice calm but firm. "Let me take care of it." Luther's shoulders stiffened. His pride tightened around his chest like a vice. "No." His voice was hoarse. Shaq studied him for a long moment. Man, it's just a meal. Ain't no shame in letting someone help. Luther shook his head, looking down at his hands. I promised Celeste tonight would be perfect. His voice was barely above a whisper. I wanted to do this for her. Celeste placed a gentle hand on his. Luther, you already did. This night was perfect because we were together. Luther closed his eyes. He felt defeated. Preston scoffed, cutting into his steak. This is what happens when people let their pride get in the way. You either pay or you leave. Simple as that. Shaq turned his gaze to Preston. His expression didn't shift, but there was something dangerous in his stare. You got a lot to say for someone who don't know a damn thing about struggle, Shaq said. Preston chuckled. I know enough. I know that some people should know their place. Silent. Luther's hands trembled with restrained anger. His entire life, he had held his head high, fought against men like Preston, and survived. But tonight he felt powerless. The manager sighed, adjusting his suit. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to settle this now. Luther slowly reached into his pocket. His fingers brushed against the last bill he had. A crumpled $20 bill. He pulled it out and placed it on the table. That's all I have, he said, voice hollow. The waiter hesitated. The manager sighed, clearly impatient. Preston snickered. You're a joke, old man. And that was it. Celeste, who had been silent through most of the exchange, suddenly slammed her palm against the table. Enough, she snapped. The entire restaurant stilled. Even Shaq blinked, taken aback. Celeste's eyes burned with emotion. How dare you speak to my husband like that? Her voice didn't waver. You sit there drinking your expensive wine, thinking you're better than everyone else. But let me tell you something. You wouldn't last a single day in my husband's shoes. Preston opened his mouth, but Celeste wasn't finished. Luther Dawson is the strongest man I've ever known. He fought battles you'll never understand. And money doesn't define him. But the way you treat people defines you. And right now, you're nothing. Preston's face darkened. Shaq smirked. She got you there, man. Preston muttered something under his breath and focused back on his meal. Luther looked at Celeste with awe, gratitude shining in his tired eyes. Shaq smiled, turning to the manager. I'm paying for their meal. No arguments. The manager hesitated, but one look at Shaq's expression told him there was no point in arguing. Very well, Mr. O'Neal, he said. Shaq turned to Luther. Let me do this for you, man. Luther finally exhaled. He nodded, the weight of the night finally lifting. The bill was settled. But the night was far from over. Because at the very back of the restaurant, a waiter had been watching everything. And the look in his eyes, it wasn't just sympathy. It was recognition. Something else was coming. And no one was ready for it. Shaquille O'Neal stood tall, his presence alone commanding the entire room. The murmur of the restaurant faded into the background as all eyes turned to him. He wasn't just some towering figure in the distance anymore. He was a force stepping into the storm. Luther, Shaq said, his voice deep, calm but impossible to ignore. Let me take care of it. Luther's spine stiffened. His hands clenched into fists beneath the table. He shook his head, his voice low but firm. No. Shaq exhaled, tilting his head slightly, as he studied the older man. This wasn't about the money. This was about pride, about dignity, about a man who had spent his entire life standing on his own 2 feet, no matter how hard the world tried to knock him down. Celeste's eyes darted between them, emotion welling up in her gaze. She reached for Luther's hand, squeezing it gently, but he wouldn't look at her. His entire focus was on Shaq, on the offer that felt heavier than the debt itself. Preston Holloway chuckled from his table, swirling the last of his wine in his glass. His smirk was smug, dripping with condescension. Ah, Preston said, leaning forward slightly. Here comes the hero moment. The big man swoops in, saves the day, writes a check, and everyone claps. Classic. Shaq didn't move. His expression didn't shift. He simply turned his gaze toward Preston, studying him the same way he had studied Luther, reading him, assessing him, understanding exactly what kind of man he was. You got a problem with helping people? Shaq asked, his voice low but carrying. Preston shrugged. I've got a problem with handouts. With people thinking money solves everything. With people. Shaq held up a massive hand, silencing him with a simple gesture. Man, you talk a lot, Shaq said, shaking his head. You talk like somebody who's never been at the bottom. somebody who's never been hungry, never had to look his wife in the eye, and tell her there ain't enough money left for the week. Preston opened his mouth, but Shaq wasn't done. You sit there in your expensive suit, sipping wine, judging people, thinking your money makes you better. But let me tell you something. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping just enough to make it feel dangerous. Your money ain't worth a damn thing if you don't know how to be a decent human being. Preston's smirk faltered. For the first time that night, he had nothing to say. Luther swallowed hard, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. He wanted to be grateful. He wanted to let Shaq help. But something inside him, something built from years of hardship, of struggle, of clawing his way through life without ever asking for a damn thing, refused to let him take it. It's not about you, Luther finally said, his voice raw. It's about me, about what I promised my wife tonight. Shaq exhaled. He understood. Luther's pride wasn't about ego. It was about a lifetime of holding on. If he accepted Shaq's help, it wouldn't just be about the bill. It would be admitting that after all these years, he couldn't take care of Celeste anymore. And that was a truth too heavy to carry. The manager, Elliot Marks, cleared his throat, his patience wearing thin. Gentlemen, I don't mean to interrupt, but we still have a bill to settle. Luther reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the last $20 bill he had. It wasn't enough. It wasn't even close, but he placed it on the table anyway. That's all I have, he said quietly. The room was silent. Shaq sighed, shaking his head. But before he could say anything else, another voice spoke up. You don't have to do this. The words came from behind them, from the waiter who had been serving them all night. His hands were clenched at his sides, his face tense with something more than just sympathy. His name tag read Ezra Kingston.
But his eyes? His eyes held something deeper.
Recognition. Shaq turned, his gaze sharp. Something on your mind, man? Ezra hesitated for half a second, then stepped forward. I know who you are, he said, looking directly at Luther. You probably don't remember me, but I remember you. Luther frowned, his tired eyes searching the young man's face. Ezra exhaled sharply. When I was a kid, my dad got into some trouble. He was innocent, but the system didn't care. They wanted to lock him up, make an example out of him. His voice wavered slightly, but he pressed on. Nobody would take his case. Nobody except you. Luther inhaled sharply. Ezra nodded. Yeah, you fought for him. You fought like hell. And because of you, my dad got to come home. He got to be there for me. Luther blinked, his throat suddenly tight. Ezra stepped closer. I never got to thank you for that. His voice dropped, filled with something raw. And I sure as hell ain't about to watch you be humiliated over a damn bill. Before Luther could react, Ezra reached into his apron and pulled out his own wallet. You're not paying for this meal, he said firmly. I am. The restaurant gasped. Even the manager looked stunned. Luther's hands trembled. Son, I can't. Yes, you can, Ezra interrupted. Because when I was a kid, you taught me that sometimes doing the right thing is more important than anything else. His voice softened. So let me do the right thing for you. Luther's lips parted, but no words came out. Celeste covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Shaq grinned. Damn. Didn't see that coming. The manager hesitated, glancing at Shaq, at Ezra, at Luther. The tension in the room had shifted, the power dynamics completely rewritten. After a long moment, the manager sighed, rubbing his temple. Fine, he muttered. Just, let's settle this and move on. Ezra handed over his own card without hesitation. The machine beeped, approved. Luther sat there frozen, as if his body didn't know how to process what had just happened. Ezra slid the receipt onto the table, nodding respectfully. It's done. For the first time that night, Luther Dawson had no fight left in him. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. Thank you. Ezra smiled. Any time, sir. The tension in the air dissipated. Preston, who had been silent through the entire exchange, scoffed under his breath, pushing back his chair. This is ridiculous, he muttered. You people and your sentimental nonsense. Shaq raised an eyebrow. Man, you still talking? Preston glared at him, then at Luther, before storming out of the restaurant. Nobody stopped him. Luther exhaled, running a hand down his face. He still didn't know how to feel, but as Celeste reached across the table, gripping his hands tightly, he knew one thing. He wasn't alone. Shaq clapped Luther on the shoulder. You good, man? Luther met his gaze. For the first time that night, he nodded. Yeah, I think I am. Shaq grinned. Good. He turned, heading back to his own table. But as he sat down, something still nagged at him. Something about Ezra. Because the way he had stepped in, it hadn't just been about a good deed. Shaq had a gut feeling. This wasn't over yet. And he was right. Because the real secret, it was still waiting to be revealed. Luther Dawson sat rigid in his chair, his shoulders squared, his hands clasped tightly together on the table. The weight of the evening pressed down on him, heavier than any case he had ever fought in court, heavier than any burden he had ever carried. He had survived a lifetime of struggle, but this was different. This was humiliation served on a silver platter, under the watchful eyes of strangers. Shaquille O'Neal remained standing beside him, calm but resolute. He had offered help, not out of pity, but out of respect. Yet, Luther had refused, not because he didn't need it. God knew he did, but because accepting it felt like an admission of failure, and Luther Dawson had never been a man to admit defeat. From across the room, Preston Holloway smirked, swirling his wine glass in slow, lazy circles. The scene unfolding before him was nothing short of entertaining. To him, Luther was just another relic from a forgotten era. A man clinging to pride while drowning in irrelevance. You see, Preston said, his voice smooth and laced with arrogance, that's the difference between men like me and men like him. Luther's jaw tightened. Shaq turned his head slowly toward Preston, his massive frame casting a shadow over the table. His expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, something that made the room feel a degree colder. You want to run that by me again? Shaq's voice was deep, measured. Preston chuckled, leaning back in his chair. I'm just saying, some people hold on too tight to things that don't serve them anymore. Pride, dignity, the illusion of control. He motioned toward Luther. They'd rather starve than accept a hand that could help them. Luther's fingers dug into the table. Shaq exhaled, shaking his head. Man, you don't know the first thing about dignity. Preston raised an eyebrow. Oh, and you do. Shaq folded his arms. Yeah, I do. See, real dignity ain't about money. It ain't about power. It's about knowing who you are, even when the world tries to tell you different. And Luther? He glanced at the older man. Luther knows exactly who he is. You just hide behind a paycheck. Preston's smirk wavered, just for a second. The tension in the restaurant was palpable. The other diners, once pretending not to watch, had stopped eating altogether. Nobody wanted to miss what was coming next. And then Ezra Kingston moved. The young waiter, who had been eerily silent up until now, suddenly stepped forward. His eyes, once neutral and unreadable, were now locked onto Luther, unblinking. Luther frowned. Son, do I know you? Ezra swallowed hard, but his voice was steady. You did, a long time ago. Shaq's gaze sharpened. He could feel it now. Something deeper was brewing. This wasn't just about a bill. This wasn't just about money or pride. This was about the past, about something unfinished, something unresolved. Ezra took another step closer. I didn't realize it was you at first, he admitted. Not until I heard your name. But then I remembered. His voice wavered slightly. I remembered everything. Celesta's hand gripped Luther's under the table. Luther inhaled sharply, eyes scanning Ezra's face. Something about him was familiar, but his mind couldn't place it. Ezra exhaled. You don't remember me, do you? Luther shook his head slowly. I'm sorry, son, but I don't. Ezra's jaw tightened. His hands balled into fists at his sides, not in anger, but in restraint. My name is Ezra Kingston. His voice lowered, and when I was 10 years old, you sent my father to prison. A cold wave swept through the restaurant. Shaq's eyes narrowed. Preston, who had been enjoying himself, now leaned in with renewed interest. Celeste gasped softly, her grip on Luther tightening. Luther's heart slammed against his ribs. What did you just say? Ezra didn't back down. You were the prosecutor on my father's case. Isaiah Kingston. You stood in that courtroom and painted him as a criminal. And because of you, my family lost everything. Luther's breath caught. Isaiah Kingston. The name crashed through him like a tidal wave, bringing memories he had long buried back to the surface. The case had been one of the most complicated, emotionally charged trials of his career. Isaiah had been accused of embezzlement, a case filled with half-truths and twisted evidence. Luther had believed in his guilt back then, but now he wasn't so sure. Ezra's voice trembled slightly. He was innocent, but nobody listened. Nobody cared. His eyes burned. And now, after all these years, you sit here, refusing help, talking about dignity. You stole my father's dignity. You stole everything from us. Luther felt like he couldn't breathe. Shaq glanced between them, his instincts telling him this conversation was about to go somewhere dangerous. Luther shook his head slowly. Son, I didn't know. If I had any doubt back then. But you didn't, did you? Ezra cut him off. You were so sure, and now look at you. You know what this is, Mr. Dawson. This is karma. The words sliced through Luther like a blade. Celeste's voice, fragile but firm, broke through the silence. Ezra, I'm so sorry for what happened to your family. Ezra exhaled, his eyes flickering with conflicted emotions. Preston, watching with wicked amusement, let out a low chuckle. Oh, this just keeps getting better. Shaq's jaw tightened. He turned toward Preston. Man, if you don't shut up. Preston smirked but said nothing. Luther, still shaken, looked up at Ezra. His voice was raw. I can't change what happened, but if I was wrong, he swallowed hard. If I was wrong, then I need to make it right. Ezra stared at him for a long moment. And how do you plan on doing that? Luther exhaled, rubbing his temples. I don't know yet. Ezra studied him. He had spent years hating this man, blaming him for everything. And yet, looking at him now, he just looked tired. Shaq, sensing the shift, finally spoke. You know, there's something my mama used to say. His voice was softer now, more measured. She said, pride don't keep you warm at night, but doing the right thing, that'll give you peace. Ezra exhaled. His fists slowly unclenched. Luther, for the first time that night, looked truly vulnerable. Let me fix this. Ezra, let me at least try.
A long pause.
Then finally, Ezra nodded. All right. Luther's shoulders sagged with relief. Shaq grinned. See? That wasn't so hard, was it? Ezra shook his head, a small smirk forming despite himself. Guess not. Celeste squeezed Luther's hand. For the first time all night, the weight in his chest felt a little lighter. Preston, watching the entire exchange, rolled his eyes and stood up. This was a waste of my evening. He threw a few bills on the table. Enjoy your little moment. It won't change a thing. Shaq grinned. Funny, I was just thinking the same thing about you. Preston glared at him before storming out. The restaurant exhaled. Luther looked at Ezra. We should talk. Really talk. Ezra nodded.
Yeah, we should.
And just like that, everything had changed. But the night was far from over. The restaurant had settled into a hushed stillness. But the energy in the air had changed. It wasn't just about a bill anymore. It wasn't just about pride or kindness. This was something deeper, something old, something unfinished. Shaquille O'Neal sat back in his chair, his sharp eyes flicking between Luther Dawson and Ezra Kingston. He had sensed from the beginning that something more was brewing beneath the surface, but even he hadn't expected this. Luther looked at Ezra, his face lined with a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. The name Isaiah Kingston had unlocked something in his memory, something he had buried under years of struggle and survival. Your father, Luther said slowly, the words thick on his tongue. I remember now. Ezra's jaw tightened. Do you? Luther nodded, running a trembling hand down his face. Your father's case. And he stopped himself, his throat tightening. Shaq leaned forward slightly, his deep voice cutting through the silence. Luther, what happened? Luther exhaled. His hands clenched together on the table, as he forced himself to go back, to remember the moment everything changed. Luther Dawson had once been one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the country. He had spent years fighting cases that others wouldn't touch, standing in courtrooms where the odds were stacked against him, pushing back against a system built to break men like him. And then there was Isaiah Kingston's case. Isaiah had been a local community leader, a man who had helped people when no one else would. He had built outreach programs, fought for better housing, and demanded accountability from city officials. He had been a threat to powerful men. And then one day the system came for him. They accused him of embezzling funds from his nonprofit. The evidence was shaky, the witnesses unreliable, but they didn't need truth. They just needed a verdict. Luther had believed in him. He had fought for him. But the prosecution had been relentless, their power too great. And when the verdict came down, guilty, Luther had felt something inside him break. He had watched as Isaiah was taken away, his wife collapsing in the back of the courtroom, his son Ezra, just a boy then, watching with wide, uncomprehending eyes. And then not long after, Luther's life had crumbled, too, because Isaiah's conviction had been a warning shot. The people who had orchestrated it hadn't been satisfied with just taking down one man. They had come for Luther next. Luther blinked, returning to the present, his throat dry. He turned his gaze toward Preston Holloway, who was watching with quiet amusement. "It was your father," Luther said, his voice hoarse. "Your father was the one who destroyed my life." Preston's smirk didn't fade. If anything, it grew sharper. "Oh, come on now, Dawson," Preston said smoothly. "Destroyed? That seems a little dramatic, don't you think?" Shaq's brow furrowed. "You want to explain what he means by that?" Preston took his time, adjusting his cufflinks. "My father was a very pragmatic man. He understood how the world worked, and when certain people," he flicked a glance at Luther, "didn't know their place, he reminded them." Luther's hands trembled. "He blacklisted me, took away my ability to practice law. I lost everything, my job, my home, my savings. He made sure I could never fight another case again." Preston nodded, utterly unfazed. "Yes, well, my father had a talent for making problems disappear." Shaq's hands tightened into fists, his knuckles cracking. "Man, you are real comfortable talking about your daddy's crimes in public." Preston shrugged. "What's the worst that could happen? A few gasps? A dramatic exit?" He smiled. "No one cares. No one ever did." Shaq shook his head, his voice quiet but firm. "You're wrong about that." Ezra, who had been standing silently, his body rigid with restrained emotion, suddenly slammed his palm onto the table. The entire restaurant flinched. "You don't get to talk about my father like that," Ezra hissed. "You don't get to sit there and act like it was just business." Preston sighed, clearly bored. "It was just business, kid." Ezra's hands curled into fists. But before he could say another word, Luther placed a hand on his arm. "Ezra," Luther said softly, "I know how this feels. I know the anger, the frustration, the years of feeling powerless." Ezra's breathing was ragged. His body was tense. "He destroyed my family." Luther nodded. "He destroyed mine too." Shaq's voice rumbled low. "Then maybe it's time to make things right." Luther inhaled sharply. "How?" Shaq leaned back in his chair, arms folded. "We expose the truth." Preston laughed. "The truth? And what exactly is that gonna do? My father is dead. The world moved on." Ezra's eyes burned. "I didn't move on." Celeste, who had been quiet until now, reached into her small purse and pulled out something, a small, worn-out envelope. She placed it on the table. Luther's eyes widened. "Celeste, what?" She met his gaze, her own filled with quiet resolve. "I kept it all these years. Every document, every piece of evidence, every letter that proved Isaiah Kingston was innocent."
Ezra's breath caught.
Preston's smirk finally faded. "You're bluffing." Celeste shook her head. "I'm not." Shaq grinned. Well, looks like you ain't as untouchable as you thought." Luther's hands trembled as he reached for the envelope, flipping it open. Inside were pages of documents, court transcripts, financial statements, letters from whistleblowers who had been silenced. It was enough to destroy the Holloway name. Ezra's voice was thick. "This could clear my father's name." Luther's throat tightened. "And it could bring justice to all the people your father ruined," he said, looking straight at Preston. For the first time, Preston looked unsettled. His confidence wavered, if only for a second. "You release that, and you make a lot of powerful people very unhappy," Preston warned. Shaq shrugged. "Ain't my problem." Preston exhaled, standing up abruptly. "This dinner has been fascinating, but I think I've had enough." He turned, but Shaq's deep voice stopped him in his tracks. "Where you going, man?" Shaq asked. "We're just getting started." Preston's face was tight. "You don't understand how the world works, O'Neal." Shaq grinned. "Nah, I understand just fine. I just don't play by your rules." Luther, holding the envelope in his trembling hands, felt something he hadn't felt in decades. Power. Ezra turned to him, his voice quiet but urgent. "Luther, what do we do?" Luther looked at Celeste, at Shaq, at the documents in his hands. He exhaled. "We tell the truth," he said. Preston scoffed, but there was a flicker of unease in his expression. "You'll regret this," Preston muttered. Luther's lips curled into a small, knowing smile.
No, Preston.
For the first time in a long time, I won't. And just like that, everything had changed.
Go.
Ezra's hands tremble as he unfolds the aged letter. Its edges worn with time, but its contents sharper than ever. The restaurant, once filled with quiet murmurs and clinking silverware, now feels like a courtroom. Every patron, every server, every gaze is locked onto the fragile sheet of paper, a document that holds the truth buried for decades. Luther's eyes scan the words, his breath shallow. His fingers trace the ink, as if touching the ghosts of his past. The letter details the conspiracy that dismantled his life, the false accusations, the legal blackballing, the orchestrated financial ruin. Preston Holloway's father was at the center of it all. A system designed to silence men like Luther had done its job well. A single chuckle breaks the tension. Preston, leaning back in his chair, folds his arms. So what? He muses, eyes gleaming with arrogance. Ancient history. Nothing changes. Celeste gasps, her hands covering her mouth, as if to hold back years of unspoken pain. Ezra, his expression unreadable, tightens his grip on the letter. Shaq, sitting stone still, exhales, his massive presence now a force beyond just muscle, a man who understands what it means to fight battles unseen. Luther closes his eyes, inhaling sharply. His life had been defined by this injustice, yet he had spent decades convincing himself to move on. But can one truly move on when the weight of the past still crushes the soul? Shaq leans forward, his voice steady but filled with unshaken resolve. You know, I've seen power misused in more ways than one. I've seen people torn down just for daring to stand tall. He looks at Luther, then at Ezra. But I've also seen that truth has a way of breaking through, even when it's buried deep. Preston scoffs. Oh, please, you think waving a dusty letter around is gonna change anything? The world moves forward. That's how power works. It stays with those who know how to keep it. Ezra steps forward, his eyes locking onto Preston's with a quiet fury. Your father stole everything from him, he says, voice low but sharp. And you think you get to smirk through it? You think you get to walk away like nothing ever happened? Preston sips his wine, unbothered. I don't think I know. The restaurant's manager, who had been hovering nearby, shifts uncomfortably. Some of the other guests exchange glances, their whispered conversations shifting from idle curiosity to something deeper. The weight of the moment is undeniable. Luther finally speaks, his voice raw. I fought for people like you, he says to Preston. I fought so that justice wouldn't be a privilege, but a right. And for that I lost everything. He grips the letter, his knuckles white, because men like your father decided I was too much of a problem to exist. Preston smirks. And yet here you are. A man who couldn't even pay for his own dinner. The words land like a slap. Celeste's eyes well up. But before she can respond, Shaq's voice cuts through. You're right about one thing, Preston, he says. Power stays with those who know how to keep it. But you ever stop to think about how fragile that power is when it's built on a lie?
Preston raises an eyebrow, amused.
Enlighten me. Shaq gestures toward Ezra. That letter? It's more than just words. It's proof. Proof that your family stole a man's life. Proof that the game you've been playing has been rigged from the start. He leans in slightly. Now imagine what happens when that proof gets out. For the first time, Preston hesitates. It's a flicker barely noticeable. But enough. Shaq catches it. So does Ezra. Ezra holds up his phone. I recorded everything, he says calmly. Every word. Every smirk. Every damn insult. Preston stiffens. You wouldn't dare. Ezra smiles. Try me. The shift in the room is palpable. The restaurant staff, the diners, the very air itself seems to tilt away from Preston, the weight of truth pressing down on his manufactured confidence. Luther looks at Ezra, eyes filled with something unreadable. Pride, gratitude, perhaps even the faintest flicker of hope. Why? He asks, voice barely above a whisper. Why now?
Ezra swallows hard.
Because I remember. His voice shakes, but his conviction does not. I remember what you tried to do for my family. I remember you fighting when no one else would. And I remember watching everything you built get ripped away. His jaw tightens. I was a kid then, but I'm not a kid now. Silent. Preston exhales sharply, running a hand through his hair. So what? You think you can undo decades of history with a recording? Ezra tilts his head. No, he admits, but I can damn sure make people listen. Shaq nods. And once people listen, change happens. Luther watches the scene unfold. years of silence crashing down around him. He had spent so long believing that the fight was over, that justice was an illusion. But here it was, standing before him, demanding to be acknowledged. Celeste reaches for his hand, her grip firm. "Luther," she whispers, her voice thick with emotion. "This is your moment." His moment. For the first time in decades, he feels something stir deep within him. Not anger, not revenge, but something far stronger. Resolve. He straightens his spine, his voice regaining the strength it once carried in courtrooms, long past. "Preston," he says evenly, "your family buried me once. But the thing about the truth," he smiles, small but unshaken, "it doesn't stay buried." Preston stands abruptly, knocking his chair back. His confidence is cracking. His smirk is gone. "This isn't over," he hisses. Ezra shrugs. "No," he agrees. "It's just beginning." The entire restaurant watches as Preston storms out, his footsteps heavy with the weight of a power he no longer fully controls. A slow, hesitant clap breaks the silence, then another, and another. The restaurant, once merely spectators, now acknowledge what just happened. Luther, still holding Celeste's hand, breathes in deeply. The air feels different, lighter. Shaq grins. "So, dessert?" A laugh bubbles up in Celeste's throat, breaking the tension. Even Luther chuckles, shaking his head. Ezra looks at the letter one last time before folding it, handing it back to its rightful owner. "What happens next?" he asks. Luther looks around the restaurant, at the people who now know his truth, at the battle he thought was lost, but wasn't. He exhales. "We fight." Celeste's hands tremble as she clutches Luther's arm, her breath uneven. The weight of decades spent watching him suffer, of pretending not to notice the heaviness in his eyes, finally breaks through. Tears spill over as she looks up at him, her voice raw with emotion. "I knew," she whispers. "I knew all along, Luther." Luther stiffens, his expression unreadable. The restaurant, still charged from the confrontation, is eerily silent. Every pair of eyes is locked on them, waiting, listening. Celeste swallows hard, the words rushing out as if they've been caged for too long. "I saw it in the way you'd stare at the old law books you never touched again. In the way you'd tighten your grip on your fork every time a man in a suit walked by. I saw it in the way you smiled at me, like you were trying to convince yourself that life was still good." Her voice cracks. "But I never knew how to help. So I stayed quiet. And I'm so sorry." Luther exhales slowly, his shoulders sinking under the weight of her confession. He had spent his life believing he had suffered alone, that no one saw, no one understood. But she had. She always had. Shaq, watching the moment unfold, leans forward, his deep voice cutting through the silence. "You know," he says, looking between them, "there's a difference between losing and letting go." Luther's gaze shifts toward him, the words settling in the air between them. Shaq continues, his tone steady, measured. "I've seen men lose everything. Seen them broken, bitter, angry at the world. But I've also seen men who should have lost, who should have crumbled, stand up and say, 'Nah, you don't get to take this from me.'" He pauses, locking eyes with Luther. "The world did its best to take everything from you. And yeah, it knocked you down. But man, it never took you." The words land heavier than a punch. Shaq gestures toward Preston, who sits stiffly at the edge of his seat, his fingers tapping an uneasy rhythm on the table. "People like him, they live their lives thinking power is a thing you hold over others. That control is the same thing as strength. But real strength?" Shaq shakes his head. "Real strength is knowing you can burn everything down, but choosing to build instead." Preston scoffs, but there's no confidence behind it. His usual arrogance is dulled, his face slightly pale. Shaq smirks, feeling uneasy. Preston exhales sharply, rolling his shoulders back. "Please," he mutters, though there's a slight waver in his voice. "This little speech means nothing. The world doesn't work on justice and happy endings. It works on power, and people like you, like him, never hold it for long." Shaq chuckles, shaking his head. "You just don't get it, do you?" He leans in slightly. "This isn't about power anymore. It's about truth. And truth?" He glances around the room, at the waitstaff, the guests, the manager who had hesitated to intervene. Truth spreads. For the first time, Preston shifts uncomfortably. The once silent restaurant is no longer passive. Eyes that had once avoided conflict are now watching, judging, and worse, change. Luther watches it unfold, something stirring deep within him. He spent his life fighting for justice, for dignity, only to have it stolen from him. And yet here it was, unfolding before him, not through revenge, but through something far greater. Celeste squeezes his hand, her eyes pleading. Luther, don't let them take another second of your life. He breathes in, then out. Slowly, purposefully. Then his voice, steady and firm, fills the space. I spent years believing I lost, he says, believing that my silence was the only way to survive. He shakes his head, but survival isn't living. And living isn't just breathing, it's standing up, even when the world tries to keep you down. He turns to Ezra, gratitude in his eyes. Thank you for reminding me who I am. Ezra nods, something like relief washing over his face. Then suddenly a phone rings, a sharp, piercing sound that cuts through the tension like a blade. All heads turn toward the source. Preston pulls out his phone, glances at the screen, and his face drains of color. Luther watches the shift happen in real time. The way Preston's grip tightens around the device. The way his breath hitches. His posture stiffens. Shaq raises an eyebrow. Bad news? Preston doesn't answer immediately. He swipes the screen and lifts the phone to his ear. What? His voice is tight, controlled, but barely. A pause. A voice on the other end too quiet to make out. Then Preston's chair scrapes back as he stands abruptly, his hands shaking. That's impossible. Another pause. A sharp inhale. Preston's entire demeanor shifts. The arrogance, the smirking bravado. It vanishes. What's left isn't power. It isn't control. It's fear. He turns on his heel, moving quickly toward the exit. No more words. No final retort. Just a man walking away from the wreckage of his own making. The moment he disappears, the entire restaurant exhales, as if they'd been collectively holding their breath. Ezra glances at Shaq. What just happened? Shaq leans back, smirking slightly. I don't know, he says, but I'd bet a whole lot that Preston just lost something big. Luther watches the door swing shut, a strange sense of peace settling over him. Not because Preston was gone, but because for the first time Preston's departure didn't feel like a win for men like him. It felt like a reckoning. Celeste wipes at her eyes, a small wobbly smile breaking through. I think, she whispers, we can go home now. Luther nods, squeezing her hand. Yeah, he says, we can. As they stand, Shaq claps a massive hand on Luther's shoulder. Hey, he says, grinning. Dinner's still on me, by the way. Luther chuckles, shaking his head. You don't give up, do you? Shaq winks. Not when I know a good investment. Luther laughs, really laughs, for the first time in years. It rumbles through the space, warm and full. Ezra watches them, then slowly unbuttons his apron, setting it down on the table. The manager frowns. What are you doing? Ezra smiles, something free and unburdened in his eyes. Quitting. The manager blinks. Just like that? Ezra nods. Just like that. He turns to Luther, extends a hand. It's an honor to know you. Luther grips it firmly, his voice strong. Likewise. As they all step toward the exit, the restaurant, once a place of quiet injustices, feels different, changed, because the truth had been spoken. And once spoken, truth never fades. Shaq leans back in his chair, arms crossed, watching the weight of the moment settle over everyone. Preston is gone. The power he once held, the arrogance he wielded like a weapon, had cracked and crumbled in real time. But Shaq knows, real change isn't about just taking down one man. It's about making sure the damage he caused is undone. He pulls out his phone, scrolling through his contacts with the ease of a man who knows exactly who to call when something needs fixing. The restaurant is still buzzing with whispers, but Shaq's focus remains sharp. He dials, lifts the phone to his ear, and waits. A deep voice answers on the other end. Yeah, it's me, Shaq says, his tone casual, but there's an undercurrent of something heavier. I need a favor. Luther watches him, brow furrowing. Shaq, what are you doing? Shaq grins. Cleaning up a mess, old man. Luther opens his mouth to protest, but Shaq raises a hand. Relax. You've done enough fighting. Let someone else throw a few punches for once. Just watch. The conversation on the other end of the line continues. Shaq's voice drops lower, his words precise, cutting. He speaks of corruption, of buried truths, of a legacy stolen. The person on the other end, Someone with power. Someone who can do something. Listen. A pause. Then a firm response. Shaq smiles. Yeah, that's what I thought. Handle it. He ends the call and pockets his phone, leaning back with a satisfied sigh. Done. Luther's eyes narrow. What do you mean done? Shaq shrugs. I mean that by this time tomorrow your name is going to be all over the news. The truth, the real truth is coming out. Your reputation, restored. Every case they forced you to drop, reopened. And every single person who had a hand in burying you. He smirks. They're going to have a long week. Luther stares at him, his throat tightening. For decades he thought justice was beyond his reach. That no one cared enough to fix what had been broken. But here it was, happening. Celeste presses a hand to her mouth, her eyes glassy. Luther exhales, shaking his head in disbelief. He turns to Shaq, his voice thick. Why would you do this for me? Shaq grins, standing up. Because men like you made men, like me, possible. Ezra, who had been quiet through the exchange, suddenly steps forward. His fists clench, then unclench. His gaze flickers to the restaurant manager, then to the apron still tied around his waist. Then, without hesitation, he unknots it and tosses it onto the table. The fabric lands with a soft thud, but the sound feels louder somehow. A statement. The manager's eyes widen. Ezra, what are you doing? Ezra straightens his shoulders. Walking away from silence, the manager sputters. You need this job. Ezra shakes his head. No. You need people like me to stay quiet. And I'm done. The energy in the room shifts again. First Preston. Now this. A restaurant that had once thrived on quiet injustices is now witnessing something it was never meant to. A rebellion. A reckoning. Ezra turns to Luther, his voice steady. I don't know where I'm going next. But I know one thing. I'm not waiting tables in a place that lets men like Preston eat comfortably. Luther reaches out, gripping Ezra's shoulder firmly. Wherever you go, make it count. Ezra nods, a small smile breaking through. I intend to. The restaurant manager swallows hard, looking around. The waitstaff, the guests, they're all watching, all aware in a way they hadn't been before. The foundation of this place, built on quiet tolerance of the powerful, has cracked. Shaq, sensing the moment coming to an end, claps his hands together. All right, well, as much as I love a good dramatic exit, I got a flight to catch. He turns to Luther and Celeste. You two good? Celeste smiles. The first real, unburdened smile she's worn in years. She looks at her husband, her partner of 50 years, and something between them, something old but never lost, flares back to life. Luther nods. Oi, steady. We're good. Shaq grins. Good. Then let's get out of here. As they move toward the exit, a ripple of something unexpected follows them. A waiter, standing near the bar, subtly unties his apron. Another employee, watching from a corner, slips their notepad onto a table and turns away. Small, quiet acts of defiance, of change. By the time they step outside, the air feels different. Luther takes a deep breath. The night is crisp. The city alive. But for once he doesn't feel like he's simply existing in it. Celeste steps close, lacing her fingers through his. She leans in, her voice a whisper, but strong. For the first time in decades, she says, her words carrying the weight of 50 years, we are free. And as they walk away hand in hand, past a restaurant that will never be the same, the world feels just a little bit different than it did before. Some stories entertain. Others make you think. But the best ones? They stay with you. Power, dignity, justice. What happens when they collide? This isn't just about one dinner. It's about the choices we make, the voices we amplify, and the truths we refuse to bury. Because in the end, the real question isn't who holds power, it's who has the courage to challenge it.